In the last video, we started talking about the farmers, and we said, well, what do the farmers think about all of this? What do they think about genetic modification? And we went down a road talking about Monsanto and about Roundup and glyphosate-free or resistant crops. So we said that Monsanto got to a point where they began to patent the seeds. And these seeds they would have to be purchased every single year. They would have to be replenished, and the farmers could not take the produce that they grew the year before and replant that as far as the seed goes and grow something that was like the parent compound. They would have to purchase these year after year after year. All right, well, here we have another problem. And this problem were farmers that did not want genetically modified crops ended up getting genetically modified crops in their fields. And the reason, and it should have looked like someone saw it coming, right? I mean, USDA, the EPA, the FDA was all there. They were all involved, and no one really thought this through, that this would happen. So the title that this was called is called genetic drift. And what it means is that if I'm a farmer and I have a row of crops that are growing, and let's say here's a street, and then up the street I have another farmer and they have rows of crops that are growing, a couple of things can happen here. Wind, right? So wind could come in, and when these things begin to flower and bloom and start producing fruit, that pollen that can actually be picked up by the wind and down the road to the other farmer. And now we have a cross. Now we have a potential genetic modified seed or genetic code that has now went down the road to another farmer. We often see this happen with pollinators as well, and those pollinators can be birds and they can be insects like honeybees. So this is what we would refer to in the laboratory environment as a cross-contamination. It's impossible to prevent. There's no regulation in it. This pollen from a GM product can move to a non-GMO field, and that could actually change the genetic code of those products where we start having genetically modified crops. Genetic drift is a major problem. Now, at first glance, you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute. I mean, wouldn't genetic drift be beneficial to the farmer that didn't have the genetically modified crop? Because they wouldn't have to pesticide it, they wouldn't have to herbicide it, they wouldn't really have to it'd grow bigger crops, they'd get more, it'd be more substantial. Isn't this a benefit all the way around? And the answer is no, it's not. So why? Why would this not be good for a farmer? Well, remember, I told you that some farmers wanted to stay non-GMO. There's a reason for that. So genetic drift came around after a couple of things took place. Here they are. In the year 2000, Starlink corn, which was not approved for human consumption, is found in over 300 food products, sparking mass recalls. Farmers harmed by depressed corn prices file a class lawsuit and settle with $100 million for their losses. Here we have a genetic modified corn that was not approved, but you have to grow it in the field to see if it's actually going to work. And it just so happened that was blown away by the wind, by the honeybees, by any other pollinator, and that corn began to grow in other fields. Those farmers had no clue. Those farmers did not know that that genetic modification had ventured into their own field, and they were growing genetically modified crops, and they had no clue that they were growing genetically modified crops because, listen, genetic modified crops should look the same, taste the same, act the same, and everything, right? So they were selling these items. Companies were purchasing these items. Corn was coming in. They were producing corn just like usual. And that is how it found its way into food products. The farmers did not know. The growers of Starlink corn did not know. The companies that purchased the corn didn't know. But yet they still made the food product and still sold it to a consumer, and consumers still ate it even though it was not approved for human consumption at that particular point in time. All over wind and bees. 2006, U.S. rice supply is contaminated with a Bayer GMO variety. It costed farmers millions. Why? Because when they tried to export it, some of these export nations basically looked at this product and said, no, you're trying to sell us a genetically modified product, and in this case, rice. And our company's not approved. Our country is not approved to handle genetic modification. Therefore, all of it was rejected. It was sent back to the farmer. Bayer pays $750 million to 11,000 farmers. Notice the word here, contaminated. Again, did these farmers know that they were growing them? No. Otherwise, they wouldn't have tried to sell them. Especially to countries that did not accept genetically modified produce. 2013, Roundup Ready wheat variety is found in Oregon. But this was after field trials ended 10 years earlier. When this was broke out in the news, South Korea and Japan said, "Whoop, no more wheat." I mean, there's a couple of times here this semester that I've talked about China and how China's manipulated the food industry multiple times. The melamine issue, the honey issue, and now we are part of that as well. We're growing wheat. Wheat was genetically modified to be Roundup Ready, just like corn. South Korea, Japan finds out about it and says, absolutely not. We're not going to take any more of your wheat right now because it's been genetically modified. And this happens 10 years after field trials ended. And it was still around. It was still lingering. It was still out there. 2014, Midwestern corn growers sue Syngenta after China closes its markets when a genetically modified trait called MIR 162, which was not approved in China, is found in corn shipments from the United States. China said absolutely not. This is genetic modification. We told you we don't want genetic modified produce, especially corn. Well, these farmers grew. These farmers were rearing or raising this corn, harvesting it and selling it. Maybe they had no clue. China says, sorry, send it back. It costed farmers $1 billion, 2013. $1 billion, they took another hit. They took another loss. Just because it was a reject, because it was genetically modified. 2014, Monsanto pays $250,000 to wheat growers associations and $2 million into a settlement fund for farmers that are located in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Meanwhile, Roundup Ready wheat is found in Montana. Again, over a decade after the trials ended. Montana. Well, you need to look on the map. You need to look at Washington, Oregon, and Idaho and figure out where Montana's at. And now you can see how this thing begins to spread. This is the problem with genetic drift. I've got a farmer who has purchased the seeds. They knew they were growing genetically modified food. That farmer is A-okay with it. Not a big deal. But they know when they sell their product who it needs to go to. That needs to go to people who are okay with GM foods. The farmer that might be nearby that could get some genetic drift due to pollination issues, he thinks he's growing non-GM. That non-GM is getting sold to companies that require non-GM. That food is getting sold to countries that require non-GM. And he thinks he's raising non-GM food. And then when he sells it to them and they test it just to make sure, it's coming back positive for a genetic modified trait, unbeknownst to the farmer that grew it. That produce gets rejected. He takes it back. And he loses out on money. That's an issue. That's a problem that has to be taken care of. And right now, there is no regulation on genetic drift. And right now, we know that it's pretty much impossible to prevent. I mean, what are you going to do? Tell a farmer that they're going to have to fully encase their crop production, their fields, just so this stuff cannot get out? It's crazy talk. But is that what it's going to lead to prevent these things from happening? In addition to genetic modification, we also get what we call supers. What are supers? They're super weeds and they're super bugs. The world of genetic modification focuses on modifying a food product to make it better, right? In the meantime, though, during this, if you're producing a product that has a bug, and that bug goes out and eats and eats and eats, and then it gets contaminated, and it kills itself because of the built-in pesticide in maybe that corn stalk, there's going to be times where maybe one or two bugs survive it. Those one or two bugs could have a natural immunity to it. I mean, these things happen, right? And if that happens, the bugs that survive will create offspring. And that offspring will have that newly modified genetic trait inside of their DNA code. So superbugs are basically bugs that can't get killed from some of the run-of-the-mill pesticides that we have used for a number of years. And the reason is because they're adapting. Mother Nature is doing it. The whole concept of natural selection, it's happening here, right in front of our eyes. All of the bugs that are not immune are getting killed out. All of the bugs that are immune to it are staying around. Those bugs are mating, they're having offspring, and guess what? Those offspring carry the trait now. So over time, you're getting a superbug, meaning they are not susceptible to the common pesticides that we've always used. Well, weeds are no different. Weeds are living things too. They learn how to adapt. So if I have a field and that field has crops that are growing, and those crops are sprayed with a herbicide to kill out the weeds, there's going to be maybe a few weeds that stay behind. And those weeds will propagate. Those weeds will have offspring. That is a natural genetic variant that survived. Survival of the fittest. And those super weeds begin to grow and begin to take over the fields. What this means is that to get rid of the super weeds and to get rid of the super bugs, we need more toxic chemicals in order to do that. It's also now more labor intensive. Going back to the good old days of going out and spraying fields down with pesticides and herbicides. This was a promise that these farmers were given that they wouldn't have to do anymore. We told them, buy the seed, grow the seed. There's a built-in pesticide. There's a built-in herbicide. So that way you can just spray your herbicides on everything, kill all the weeds and everything out, gone completely. But now they have to resort back to these very archaic methods that they were doing years and years ago. So what was the point in all of it? Just to give companies like Monsanto a bigger pocketbook during this time? If now they're going to have to go back and buy more chemicals that are more toxic to kill out all of the weeds and all of the bugs that are out there that have survived this whole onslaught, well, this is just shrinking the profits up for the farmer. Why? Why are we doing it? Well, companies like Monsanto are going to say, this would have happened anyway. I mean, if you went years and years of using the same pesticide, the same weed killers, bugs and weeds would have learned to adapt whether or not we were in the picture. You would have still had to buy pesticides. You would have had to buy a different pesticide because the bugs would have naturally became pesticide resistant to the old pesticide that you were using back in the 80s and back in the 90s. You would have had to have changed no matter what. We did not make this happen. This is just the course of natural selection. That's all that it is. In addition to that, glyphosate. Remember, I said glyphosate was made by Monsanto. Glyphosate is also known as Roundup. It was broad spectrum, so it pretty much kind of leveled out everything that it could. But now, we have 14 resistant weeds in the United States. The way that this product worked is that it altered the plant's uptake to absorb nutrients from the soil. You know, that's why we fertilize things, right? Those are the nutrients. That's the food that plants need in order to grow. And all of these roots will spread out in the dirt or the soil, and they will start absorbing all of these nutrients from the soil. And that's their food product, and that's how they grow, and that's how they get bigger, that's how they produce fruit and vegetable. Well, glyphosate reduced the soil health. It killed all of the microbes that are down into the soil. So, this is how weeds survive as well. So, if I have a built-in glyphosate-resistant product, that glyphosate is not going to cause it a problem. It's still going to absorb and uptake the nutrients that it needs. But everything else around it that's not glyphosate resistant, they are going to get affected because they cannot eat any longer and the plant begins to die. 14 resistant weeds in the United States. Here are some of them. Ragweed, horseweed, Johnson grass, palmer leaf, rye, water hemp, and the common ragweed. All of these are taking over more and more and more and more. That's because everyone has relied on basically Roundup or a glyphosate-based product to kill all of the weeds over the so many number of years that we've been doing it. And now the weeds have adapted. Natural selection has taken place. The survival of the fittest is right in front of our eyes. And these are the ones that are surviving. These are the ones that are growing. And these are the ones that are not going to die with the incorporation of a Roundup-based product or a glyphosate-based product. Now, I keep talking about glyphosate, right? I keep mentioning Roundup. So here's the structure of glyphosate. If you look at the structure, this is a C double bond OOH. So here we have a carboxylic acid group. Here's a carbon. And here's a nitrogen onto a hydrogen. So this is almost like an amino group here, right? Very similar to an amino acid. Not quite, but it's close. It's kind of got all the important pieces that are there. And then off of the nitrogen, we get this carbon, and we get the phosphate. Of course, it's glyphosate, not phosphate, but phosphate. Sometimes I actually say phosphate. It keeps in me in mind that there is a phosphate group that's there. So we see PO3H2. This is glyphosate. This is the active ingredient in Roundup. And if you've noticed, a lot of people don't like Roundup either. Okay, so there's got to be a reason. It's a Monsanto killer. Monsanto's evil chemical company. They're out to kill us all. Okay, well, is that necessarily true? Well, the problem here is that over time, as people use Roundup, as people use glyphosate-based weed killers, we have now seen a tendency to have to use more and more and more over a course of time. So this is rose 4,000 tons, 1987, to more than 80,000 tons in 2007. 20 years, a 2,000% increase in glyphosate weed killer. The usage of this product has skyrocketed. People do not like this product. Some people will look at Roundup and think that it is a killer, not only for weeds, but for everything else too. Again, Monsanto. Again, Agent Orange, DDT, PCBs. All of those were not very good products made by that company, and now we're using a product made by that company that did all of those whoopsies. Why do people not like Roundup? Well, here's a graph. Liver and bile duct cancer compared against glyphosate. Okay, so if you take a look at this chart, the way that you need to look at this is that the combination here, male and female, has a tendency to go up, 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 up. If you look at the black line, this is glyphosate, and it's glyphosate on corn and soy product. Again, this starts happening like mid-90s. Here's the line. There we go. In addition to that, look at the trends with everything else. We do start to see a slight uptick, right, in the 80s with liver and bile duct cancer. But after that, it begins to skyrocket. Is this proof that glyphosate and liver cancer are tied together? The answer is no, not necessarily. Just because one goes up doesn't mean the other goes up. Or just because one goes up and the other goes up, that they have a relationship between each other. But it is data. And over a course of years, the cases of liver and bile duct cancer has increased. And glyphosate, as we said before, has dramatically increased. If you take a look at breast cancer, there's your trend. As glyphosate usage goes up, 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 Breast cancer claims also trend up, 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 up with almost the same magnitude. So it happened with liver. It happened with breast. Here's the data compared against kidney cancer. All right, so glyphosate corn is the red line. Up, 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 up. And if you look at the cases of kidney cancer, up, 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 up. They almost trend together. Liver cancer trends very close. Breast cancer trends very close. Kidney cancer trends very close. Autism trends almost match. The red line represents basically glyphosate usage, and the bars represent cases of autism. Those are almost a perfect match. Thyroid cancer. Red line, orangey line that you see on the screen, there's your increase of glyphosate. And then if you look at the yellow bars, that is the thyroid cases that have claimed people over the number of years. They are almost on top of each other. The trends are very, very close. Dementia. Glyphosate usage, again, is in the orangey color. The deaths per people, or per 100,000, those bars also trend basically right on top of the glyphosate usage. Alzheimer's. Deaths from Alzheimer's. Glyphosate usage goes up, which is the red line. And then if you look at the bars, cases per 100,000, death per 100,000, those bars trend very closely to increased glyphosate usage. Diabetes. Red line, glyphosate. Bars, people. Notice when glyphosate usage came in, mid-90s, that begins to tick up and it grows exponentially. And the same thing happens to diabetes as well. These green lines that you're seeing on the screen, like for this one, notice here before glyphosate came into the picture, they were increasing, but just take a look at this. If you made this as a calibration curve and I asked you to extend the calibration curve, kind of forecast it, well, you would have continued on in that manner. We knew that it was going to increase little bit by little bit by little bit, but this green line would have been the trend line. But here in the 90s, they go straight up. Same thing happened here with dementia. The green line represent the trajectory or the forecast. But notice when glyphosate was introduced, those cases trend upward when glyphosate trend upward. All right, so there's diabetes. Urinary and bladder cancer. Red line is glyphosate usage. And then the number of cases are the yellow bars. Look at your mid-90s. Trending, trending, trending. But in the mid-90s, exponentially, they both go up. Here, Parkinson's disease. Again, mid-90s, glyphosate was introduced. Exponentially rose, up, 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 up. And then Parkinson's disease also goes up accordingly. Once more, the green line would have been the trajectory but notice the significant enhancement of cases throughout that time. Parkinson's, urinary bladder cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's. You kind of see why now people just do not trust Roundup anymore. Liver cancer, breast cancer, kidney cancer, autism, thyroid cancer, dementia. This is why some people refuse to buy a glyphosate-based product. All of these studies that are coming out for years after years after years have showed a very strong tie between these two. This health concern and the usage of a glyphosate compound. The IARC, if you forgot what that stood for, look that up. That could be a question. We learned that in safety class. Found that glyphosate was, quote, probably carcinogenic in 2015. Austria banned it completely. Recently, absolutely no more glyphosate stuff. Absolutely no more Roundup. Germany, September 2019, we're going to ban it. No more. No more Roundup in our country. And we're going to phase this out, and it better be out of here by 2023. Got to go. There's also bans in Thailand, India, Vietnam, Scotland, Spain, Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Belgium, Greece, Denmark, France, Italy, Netherlands. United States, no national action. We're okay with Roundup. We'll just let the states decide. All of these studies tie the health concern to glyphosate usage, in some cases like autism, extremely close. The IARC looked at studies with glyphosate and said this is probably carcinogenic. Some of the other countries in the world have already placed a ban on Roundup. They're not saying you can't use pesticides and herbicides. What they're saying is that you can't use glyphosate. We have questions about this product. We're not going to allow this product to be used in our country. But the United States continues to allow it. And they're going to allow the states to make up their own decision on what they want to do. Okay, well, here are some states that have taken some action. Arizona, you've got to use other things first. If those things cannot kill the weed out, then you can divert to glyphosate as a last resort. California, Colorado, Connecticut, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Florida, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Nevada, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Texas, Vermont, they all have some type of ordinance against glyphosate. Maybe not statewide, but maybe in some of the larger populated cities, you can't use them. For certain purposes, you can't use them. For public parks, you can't use them. So nothing statewide, but individual cities, individual counties have made that decision on their own. But look at all the states that are represented here. So why? If these other countries are going through and saying we're completely banning them, and if the IARC has stated this is probably carcinogenic, and if we have all of this data that corresponds a certain health ailment, multiple health ailments, to glyphosate usage, and it continues to increase over a number of years, and they go hand in hand almost the entire time, why is the United States not saying, fine, Monsanto, You cannot produce Roundup anymore. You're going to have to go to something else. Glyphosate's not going to cut it. You can keep producing the pesticides and herbicides as you need to, but no more glyphosate-based compounds. If this many states have said no or have limited the restrictions and the usage on it, why? Why has the United States not stepped in to tell Monsanto no? Next is this concept of genetic diversity. Oh, and by the way, you can figure that last question out, right? Why do you think the United States is not telling one of the major agroculture, agrochemistry, agrobiology companies no on a glyphosate pesticide and herbicide when they own 70 to 80% of the corn and the soybean that is now glyphosate resistant? So why do you think they are telling them no? Where's the politicians at? It really starts with them. So in the next video, we're going to talk about genetic diversity. What is this concept of genetic diversity? And we might start getting into a little bit of the science finally behind DNA and the genetic code and how this process is done in order to give me a genetically modified crop.